At my sister's wedding, I expected champagne to sparkle, music to rise, and love to fill the air. Instead, I became the night's cruelest joke. My sister raised her glass and said, "Some marry rich, some raise mistakes." The guests erupted in laughter. My mother added, "At least her mistake wore shoes." My chest burned as 200 eyes turned toward me, waiting for my collapse. I wanted to disappear, but then something happened no one expected. The groom stood up, silencing the crowd, and in that moment, I knew my life was about to change forever. I was 34 years old, and if I had to define myself in a single word, it would have been sacrifice. For as long as I could remember, my life had been one long surrender to my mother's endless demands, to my sister's ambitions, to the invisible leash that bound me to a family that rarely, if ever, gave back. My paychecks disappeared into my mother's emergencies. My weekends vanished into errands for my sister. Even my sense of pride was stripped away little by little every time I was told that family comes first. And so I believed it. For years I believed it. That belief was the only reason I had poured myself into my sister's wedding as if it were my own. I ironed tablecloths at midnight, proofread vows she would barely glance at, and paid for the floral arrangements when she insisted her budget was tight. I didn't complain. I told myself this was proof of my worth, that on her wedding day, when everyone admired the perfection she demanded, maybe, just maybe, someone would see me standing there, not as the shadow in the corner, but as a part of the light. I wanted the wedding to be flawless because I thought a flawless wedding might heal something broken inside us. My sister had always been the golden one, the star, the one my mother pointed to with pride. I was the backdrop, useful but invisible. Yet as I watched the rehearsal the night before, I felt hope. Hope that if I worked hard enough, smiled bright enough, bent myself small enough, perhaps they would finally turn and say, "We couldn't have done this without Emily." The morning of the ceremony shimmered with that fragile hope. I dressed carefully, choosing a pale blue dress that wouldn't draw too much attention, but wouldn't mark me as careless either. I curled my hair, dabbed on lipstick, and stared at my reflection. The woman in the mirror looked tired, yes, but she also looked determined. I whispered to her, "Maybe today they'll finally see you." At the church, chaos swirled as bridesmaids adjusted their gowns and groomsmen searched for cufflinks. I moved quietly between them, pinning veils, steadying bouquets, soothing nerves. My sister barely glanced at me, her eyes fixed on her own reflection, adjusting her lace. My mother barked orders like a commander in battle. I told myself this was normal. Families were chaotic on wedding days. This was love in its own messy form. Then, as I was carrying a forgotten boutonniere across the hall, I felt a hand brush my arm. The groom, tall and surprisingly calm, leaned close enough that only I could hear. "Thank you, Emily," he said. His voice carried weight, not just polite gratitude, but something deeper, almost urgent. I froze. No one in my family had ever thanked me with that kind of sincerity. He paused, eyes steady on mine, and added, "One day you'll know why I said this." I blinked, uncertain whether I'd misheard. Before I could respond, someone called his name and he slipped away, leaving me standing in the corridor with my heart pounding. His words rattled in my mind. Gratitude from him? For what? All I'd done was show up, patch holes, keep quiet, roles I'd played my entire life. but the way he said it, it was as if he knew something I didn't. As the ceremony began, I sat near the back, where I wouldn't ruin the perfect photographs. I tried to focus on the music, the vows, the shining look in my sister's eyes, but my mind replayed his words again and again. One day, you'll know why I said this. It felt less like a thank you and more like a warning disguised as kindness. When the bride and groom kissed and the crowd erupted in applause, I clapped too, but my hands trembled. I tried to smile, tried to believe this was the beginning of something better for all of us. Yet in the quiet corners of my heart, a small voice whispered that it was the beginning of something else entirely, something I couldn't name yet. At the reception, I slipped between tables, checking place cards, straightening cutlery, making sure the servers didn't miss a dish. Nobody asked me to, nobody saw me doing it, but I couldn't stop myself. This was how I proved my value, by being useful, by staying invisible. When my sister swept past in her glittering gown, laughing at some joke, I caught her glance for a fraction of a second. She didn't smile. She didn't even acknowledge me. The sting was sharp, but I told myself not to feel it. Not here, not today. Still, the groom's words haunted me. Why would he thank me like that? Why say something that sounded like a secret threaded between us? I watched him across the hall, his hand resting lightly on my sister's back, his smile practiced for the guests. Once his eyes lifted and met mine. The look was fleeting, unreadable, but it felt like a message. I looked away quickly, pretending to sip my drink. The night stretched ahead, glittering and fragile. I reminded myself of my mantra: keep the peace, keep the smiles, keep the family together. But for the first time, the mantra felt shaky. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped being the shadow and let the truth step into the light. And beneath it all, the groom's voice lingered like an echo in a dark room. One day, you'll know why I said this. The reception hall glittered with chandeliers, their light spilling over silk-draped tables and crystal glasses filled with champagne. The air buzzed with chatter and clinking cutlery, a performance of joy so carefully staged that even I wanted to believe it. Guests toasted, music swelled, and my sister floated across the room like she was born for it. She had always been the star, and tonight she gleamed brighter than ever. I sat quietly at my assigned table near the back, where the family had placed me among acquaintances I barely knew. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself being there at all was enough. But then came the moment. My sister, radiant in her lace gown, raised her glass to speak. The hall fell silent, hundreds of eyes lifting toward her. I felt a strange swell of pride, even though I knew she wouldn't mention me. She never did. Still, I leaned forward, foolishly hoping. Perhaps tonight she might surprise me, just once. Her lips curved into a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Some marry rich," she began, her voice clear and strong through the microphone. "Some raise mistakes." For a heartbeat I didn't understand. The words hovered in the air, alien, disjointed, until the meaning sank into me like a blade. The hall erupted with laughter, a tidal wave crashing against me, drowning me in humiliation. My face burned, my throat closed, and my hands trembled under the tablecloth. I prayed it would end there, that the cruelty had already peaked. But my mother leaned forward, her voice carrying with ease, crueler than anything my sister could conjure. At least her mistake wore shoes. The laughter doubled, louder, harsher. filling every corner of the hall. I felt my body lock, frozen in place. 200 eyes turned toward me, some pitying, some mocking, all of them complicit in my shame. I wanted to disappear, to fold myself into nothing. My ears rang, my vision blurred. I told myself not to cry, not here, not in front of them. But inside, something cracked, a fracture so deep it reverberated through every year I had lived for them, every sacrifice I had made, all the nights I had paid bills that weren't mine, all the hours I had stayed awake to comfort them, all the times I had swallowed my pride, erased in an instant, reduced to a punchline. And then, before the laughter could crest again, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound cut through the noise like a knife. The groom rose. The hall fell into an uneasy hush. His eyes swept the crowd, then locked on my mother, then my sister, finally landing on me. There was no smile on his face, no trace of the polished charm he had worn all evening. His voice was steady, sharp enough to silence the last of the giggles. "If this is family," he said, his words hanging heavy in the air, "maybe it's better broken." The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter had been. My sister's smile faltered, confusion flashing across her face. My mother stiffened, her hand frozen halfway to her glass. Around the room, guests shifted in their chairs, whispering, their amusement curdling into discomfort. My heart pounded, not with humiliation now, but with bewilderment. What was he doing? Why would he stand against them, against his new wife, on the very night meant to unite their lives? I wanted to believe it was for me, that his words were a shield thrown across my shoulders. But suspicion gnawed at me. He didn't look like a man defending out of kindness. He looked like a man making a choice, a dangerous choice that no one yet understood. My sister laughed, a brittle sound that didn't quite land. "Oh, darling," she said, her voice tight, "you know I was just teasing." But he didn't sit down. He didn't smile. He stared at her, then at my mother, and the weight of his silence pressed harder than any words. My stomach twisted. This wasn't over. This was the beginning of something no one had planned. I lowered my eyes to my untouched plate, fighting to steady my breath. The humiliation still throbbed like an open wound, but beneath it, another feeling stirred. Fear, maybe, or anticipation. For years, my family had played their cruel games unchecked, secure in their roles. But in one sentence, the groom had shifted the ground beneath us all. Whispers spread across the hall. Who was he defending? Why did he say that? Why tonight? The guests craned their necks, eager for the next spark, the next fracture in what was supposed to be a flawless celebration. I sat in the center of it, silent, trembling, caught between the shame of their ridicule and the strange, unnerving question his words had planted. Whose side was he really on? As my sister gripped his arm and tried to steer him back into the script of their perfect evening, I caught his gaze once more. It was fleeting, but in that look was something I couldn't name. Not pity, not sympathy, something else. A warning, a promise? And as the music stumbled back to life, I realized nothing about this wedding was going to end the way any of us expected. I stumbled out of the hall before anyone could stop me, my heels clattering against the polished floor. My chest heaved, every breath jagged, as if I'd swallowed glass. The sound of laughter still echoed in my ears, an echo that wouldn't fade. I pushed through the door of the women's restroom, the music and chatter muffling behind me, and collapsed against the sink. My reflection stared back at me under the harsh fluorescent light, pale and broken. The tears came fast, unstoppable. I pressed my palms to the porcelain, bent over as sobs ripped out of me. For years I had carried the weight of this family, believing loyalty was enough to bind us together. And in a single cruel sentence, they had cut me loose, thrown me into the fire, and laughed as I burned. Images stormed through my mind, fragments of a lifetime I had tried to bury. My mother, calling at 2 a.m, voice sharp with accusation, until I handed over money I didn't have. If you loved me, you wouldn't let me struggle like this. My sister, smiling sweetly as she presented a report at work that I had written, accepting praise while I stood in the back, invisible. You don't mind, do you, Emily? You're not the type who likes the spotlight. And the whispers at family gatherings, my aunts, my cousins, exchanging looks when I walked in. Still single, still odd, still less. I remembered birthdays where no one showed up, graduations where my name was forgotten in the excitement for someone else. I remembered thinking if I just try harder, maybe they'll love me. But the truth slammed into me now with brutal clarity. They never had. Not once. My sacrifices had not earned me love. They had only bought me deeper chains. I gripped the edge of the sink, staring at the woman in the mirror. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with tears, her lipstick smudged. She looked small, pathetic, ruined. My throat tightened. Was I ever loved? The question pulsed inside me, louder than the music beyond the door. I wanted the answer to be yes. I wanted to believe that somewhere in those years of giving there had been a sliver of love, a scrap of affection. But in my heart, I knew better. The woman in the mirror blinked back at me, and I hated her weakness. I hated the way she let herself be used, the way she kept bending, kept breaking, yet never once fought back. The humiliation of the night burned hotter than my tears, searing away something fragile inside me. I straightened slowly, wiping my face with trembling hands. My breath steadied, though my heart still thundered. I stared at my reflection, forcing myself to meet my own gaze. If they call me a mistake, I whispered, voice hoarse, I'll show them mistakes can fight back. The words hung in the air, startling me with their ferocity. They didn't sound like the woman I had been, the woman who begged for scraps of approval. They sounded like someone new, someone forged from the ashes of ridicule. A silence followed, heavy but not crushing. For the first time in my life, silence felt like power, not absence. I dabbed at my eyes with tissue, repairing what I could of my makeup. My hands still shook, but there was a steadiness beneath the trembling, like the ground after an earthquake, cracked but solid. My mascara smudges faded under concealer, and as I painted my lips red again, I felt a shift inside me. The laughter from the hall drifted faintly through the door, cruel and careless. I listened to it, but this time it didn't pierce me the same way. It was noise, empty noise. In the mirror, the woman looking back at me no longer seemed quite so broken. She still bore the marks of pain, but in her eyes flickered something sharp, a spark not easily extinguished. I placed both hands on the counter, leaning forward as if I were speaking to her alone. You've spent your life being their shadow, their servant, their scapegoat. Enough. My voice grew stronger with each word. They wanted a mistake. They'll get one, but not the kind they expect. For a moment, fear slid into me. Fear of what came next. fear of stepping outside the script I'd been forced into. But it didn't stop me. If anything, it fed the fire. I stood taller, smoothing my dress, adjusting my hair. The humiliation still clung to me, yes, but layered over it now was something else. Resolve. A silent oath etched into my bones. When I finally turned to leave the restroom, my steps were slower, measured, each one carrying weight I hadn't known before. My heart no longer begged for their love. My heart was learning the language of defiance. I reached for the door handle, pausing for a beat, the echo of my vow still burning on my lips. I whispered it once more, a promise only I could hear. Mistakes fight back. And with that, I pushed the door open and stepped back into the storm. The days after the wedding were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. My phone no longer buzzed with invitations or group messages, and no one called to ask if I was safe after the spectacle. Silence had always been my companion, but this silence was different, heavier, as though my family had closed the door on me entirely now that the joke had been made and I had served my purpose. But beneath that silence, I had found a new rhythm. I began to record everything. Each time my mother called, demanding money in the name of a new crisis, I pressed the button and let her voice fill the recorder. "Emily, you don't understand. If you don't pay this, I'll be on the streets. Do you want that guilt on your conscience?" Click. Another file saved. When my sister phoned, her tone sharpened with entitlement. "I just need you to sign this, nothing complicated. The loan officer knows you. They'll approve it faster if your name is on it." Click. Saved. Every syllable, every manipulation, captured like drops of venom in a vial. I spent long nights combing through old files in my desk, boxes shoved into closets. That was when I found it, the first stack of papers that made my blood run cold. Loan agreements, signatures, my name, but not my handwriting. My information, but not my consent. They had been using me, not just emotionally, but financially. My credit, my identity, my life, leveraged for their gain. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, each one a silent witness to the theft. The ink seemed to whisper as I traced it with my finger. They had gambled with my future and left me in ignorance. For years, I had thought the weight I carried was love. Now I saw it for what it was, exploitation. Every file, every voicemail, every forged signature became a bullet I loaded carefully into an invisible chamber. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't ready to fire yet, but the sound of those recordings, the sight of those papers, gave me a strange sense of power I had never known. It was proof that I wasn't crazy, proof that the gaslighting and the guilt-tripping weren't figments of my imagination. I finally held something real in my hands. One night, as I sat surrounded by evidence, the phone rang again. I expected another demand, another guilt-laced plea. Instead, a man's voice filled the line, steady, low, unmistakable. The groom. "Emily," he said. My heart lurched. I hadn't spoken to him since the wedding, since his words cut through the hall like a blade. I could still hear them. If this is family, maybe it's better broken. "Why are you calling me?" I asked, suspicion sharpening my tone. "Because," he replied, "if you're ready, I'll help." The room spun for a moment. I gripped the edge of the table. Help? With what? There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the faint sound of his breathing. Then, "You don't know half of her secrets. Her, my sister." I pressed the phone closer, my pulse thundering. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then he said, Let's just say I didn't walk into this marriage blind, but I needed confirmation, and I think you've found it." His words hit like a storm. The groom, my sister's brand new husband, was standing against her. Why marry her at all if he carried this knowledge? What game was he playing? "I don't understand," I whispered. "You will," he said simply, "when the time is right." And then he ended the call, leaving me in the silence of my kitchen, surrounded by papers that felt heavier now than ever. I stared at the phone in my hand, replaying his words over and over. "If you're ready, I'll help. You don't know half of her secrets." A chill spread through me. I had thought I was alone in this quiet war. Now someone else was stepping onto the battlefield. A man bound to my sister by vows he'd barely spoken. Was he ally or enemy? Savior or manipulator? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but beneath it, something stronger stirred. The evidence I held was no longer just my shield, it was a weapon. And if he truly meant what he said, if he carried secrets I hadn't yet uncovered, then maybe, for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting alone. I gathered the documents into neat stacks, my hands steady now. I listened to the recordings once more, their words as damning as confession. The sound of my mother's demands, my sister's entitlement, they no longer crushed me, they armed me. The night stretched on, but I didn't feel tired. For the first time in years, my mind was sharp, alert, alive. I had evidence. I had a promise of help. And I had a vow carved deep inside me. If they called me a mistake, I would prove that mistakes could burn down the lies built on them. Christmas dinner had always been a performance in my family. A glittering stage where we dressed our dysfunction in tinsel and pretended it was love. This year, the house was decorated with garlands and lights that blinked cheerfully against the darkness outside. The table was set with silver cutlery and fine china, each place card written in elegant script. But beneath the shine, tension pulsed like a live wire. I took my seat, calm on the surface, though every nerve in my body hummed. My mother sat at the head of the table, a self-appointed queen, with my sister beside her, radiant as though the humiliation of her wedding speech had never existed. They laughed with relatives, clinked glasses, and ignored me until the moment they were ready to strike. It didn't take long. Halfway through the meal, as the roast was carved and wine poured, my mother's voice cut through the clatter of silverware. "Emily," she said, her tone dripping disdain, "when will you stop being a burden? When will you finally do something worth being proud of?" A hush fell. All eyes turned to me, waiting for the usual silence, the downcast gaze, the acceptance of humiliation. But this time I didn't flinch. I placed my fork neatly on the plate, wiped my mouth with the napkin, and stood. My movements were calm, deliberate. I could feel their eyes narrowing, confusion threading through the room. Slowly, I opened my laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting against my face. "Since you're asking," I said evenly, "let me show you what I've been doing." Click. The projector, already prepared, flickered to life on the wall behind me. An email appeared, my mother's words in black and white, begging for money, threatening guilt. Another click and a loan agreement filled the screen. My name scrawled across it in handwriting that wasn't mine. Gasps rippled through the room. "This is what you've done," I said, voice steady. "You used my name, my credit, my life, to feed your greed. You turned me into your shield, your scapegoat, and you thought I'd never find out." My mother's face drained of color, her lips parting soundlessly. My sister's wine glass froze halfway to her mouth. Around the table, relatives shifted, eyes wide, whispers starting to rise like smoke. Click. Another file. Another forged signature. Click. A voicemail, my mother's voice filling the room. If you don't help me, I'll end up on the street. Do you want that guilt, Emily? The words echoed like a confession in a courtroom. The room was silent now, except for the sound of their own sins replaying in their ears. I looked directly at my mother, then at my sister, holding their gaze without trembling. You called me a burden, I said softly, but tell me, who has carried whom all these years? The silence broke with the creak of the front door. A man in a dark suit entered, briefcase in hand. His presence was quiet, authoritative. My lawyer. He stepped to my side, laying a stack of papers on the table. These, he announced, are the official filings: fraud, identity theft, financial exploitation. The court will decide the rest. My mother stammered, words tripping over each other. This is a misunderstanding. We're family. You can't. But the lawyer cut her off. Family doesn't excuse crime. And then came the blow none of them saw coming. The groom rose from his chair at the far end of the table, his presence commanding the room in an instant. He placed his napkin down slowly, deliberately, then looked directly at my mother and my sister. His voice was cold, precise. The fraud, he said, is not Emily. He let the silence stretch, his words sinking like a knife. It's your beloved daughter. Gasps erupted, the weight of his declaration, shattering whatever fragile mask of dignity my sister had left. She turned on him, her face pale, her voice trembling. How dare you? But he didn't stop. I married you with my eyes open. I knew what you were. But I needed the truth to come out in the open, where no one could deny it, and now it has. The hall erupted into chaos. Relatives whispered, some recoiling from my mother and sister, others staring at me with shock, as if seeing me for the first time. My sister's voice rose, shrill, desperate, but her words drowned in the tide of condemnation, sweeping the table. I stood still in the storm, my laptop glowing faintly beside me, the evidence lined up like soldiers at my command. My humiliation had transformed into something stronger, sharper. Tonight, I had taken the power they stole and turned it against them. And yet, as the room fractured, a cliffhanger lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. This was not the end. Families like mine didn't crumble in a single night. They clawed, they twisted, they fought to survive. The question wasn't whether they would fall. The question was how violently they would drag each other, and me, down in the process. The fallout came swiftly, like a storm tearing through a house of cards. Within weeks, the glossy image my family had built over decades collapsed. The whispers at Christmas spread into headlines in the local papers, then into contracts being pulled, reputations tarnished. My sister lost her lucrative deal with a fashion client. No brand wanted her face tied to fraud. My mother's friends, those she had leaned on for gossip and validation, stopped returning her calls. At church, no one sat beside her anymore. They tried to fight back at first, spinning excuses, calling me vindictive, ungrateful. But evidence speaks louder than words, and I had gathered enough to silence even the boldest denials. The lawyer handled the filings, the courts moved slowly but steadily, and I let the machine of justice grind on. For once, I didn't have to carry the weight. I moved into a small apartment downtown, nothing extravagant, but entirely mine. The first night there, I sat cross-legged on the floor of the living room, surrounded by unopened boxes, no voices calling me selfish, no demands for money, just quiet. I let the silence settle into me, not as punishment, but as peace. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft buzz of traffic outside, the faint creak of pipes. These sounds felt more comforting than any words of love my family had ever given me. I made tea and curled up on the sofa, watching steam rise into the dim light. My chest felt lighter, though scars still lingered. It wasn't triumph I felt, not really. It was survival. And survival, I realized, was a victory all its own. For the first time in my adult life, I belonged to myself. In the calm of that evening, I opened my laptop. Not to display evidence this time, not to fight, but to write. The words came slowly at first, then poured out like water breaking through a dam. I used to believe family was blood, I typed. That sacrifice, loyalty, and silence were proof of love. But blood does not always mean love. Sometimes blood means chains. I paused, my fingers trembling, the weight of years pressing against me. Then I continued. Family is not who mocks you when the world is watching. Family is not who bleeds you dry and calls it duty. Family is not who calls you a mistake. Family is who stays when the world laughs at you. Family is who lifts you when you fall, who protects rather than praise, who stands in your corner when everyone else turns away. And if you, reading this, have been told you are the burden, the failure, the mistake, know this: you are none of those things. You are not alone, and you can fight back. I read the words aloud softly, my voice catching. They sounded less like a declaration and more like a lifeline tossed into the dark. I thought about the countless nights I had wished someone would tell me I wasn't crazy, I wasn't worthless. Now I was giving that to someone else, maybe to hundreds of others I'd never meet. When I hit publish on the online forum where survivors of family manipulation gathered, I didn't expect much. But within hours, replies began to appear. Women and men from across the country wrote back, "This is my story too. I thought I was alone. Thank you." The words multiplied, spreading across social media, shared and reshared. My letter became something more than confession. It became connection. Days later, a journalist reached out, asking for an interview. Advocacy groups requested permission to use my letter in workshops. My inbox filled with voices echoing my own pain. Each message was a reminder. I was no longer the mistake in the shadows. I was part of something larger, a chorus of survivors finding their strength. One evening, scrolling through the comments, I saw a simple sentence that made me pause. "You wrote exactly what I couldn't say out loud. You saved me tonight." My eyes stung as I read it again. Somewhere out there, someone had been on the edge, and my words had pulled them back. The idea humbled me, grounding me deeper than any courtroom victory ever could. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling. My family's empire of lies had crumbled, but I wasn't celebrating their ruin. What mattered was the life I was building in its place, quiet, steady, mine. I wasn't the cold avenger, the warrior without heart. I was a survivor, a woman who had learned that breaking free was not about vengeance, but about reclaiming the right to exist without chains. As I closed the laptop, the city lights blinked outside my window. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. because I knew now that even in the darkest rooms, someone else was listening. Someone else was waiting for a voice to say, "You are not a mistake." And that was the truest family I could have ever asked for.